Welcome to Echoes of WW2, where we explore the real problems America faced in World War II and the solutions that changed history. By the late 1930s, Franklin D. Roosevelt was already convinced of something most Americans were not ready to accept. Another world war was coming, and the United States would not be able to stay out of it forever. Fascism was advancing across Europe and Asia. Democracies were collapsing one by one, and the balance of global power was shifting dangerously. To Roosevelt, the question was no longer if America would be drawn in, but when and under what conditions. Yet Roosevelt faced a problem more formidable than any foreign enemy. He faced his own country. The American public was deeply committed to neutrality. The trauma of World War I still shaped national memory. Over 100,000 Americans had died in what many now believed was a pointless European conflict. The promised war to end all wars had failed. In the decades that followed, a powerful consensus emerged. Entering that war had been a mistake, and it must never happen again. This sentiment was not fringe opinion. It was mainstream, bipartisan, and politically decisive. Congress passed the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s to prevent the United States from being dragged into another foreign war. Arms sales were restricted. Loans to belligerents were banned. Even travel on ships belonging to warring nations was discouraged. These laws reflected the will of the people. America would remain neutral, even as the world burned. Roosevelt, however, saw neutrality as an illusion. From his vantage point, the collapse of Britain or the domination of Europe by Nazi Germany would eventually threaten American security, whether the public acknowledged it or not. A world controlled by hostile powers would cut off trade, destabilize the global economy, and eventually challenge the United States directly. Geography alone could no longer guarantee safety in an age of long-range bombers and submarines. But knowing this and acting on it were two very different things. In a democracy, a president cannot simply prepare for war because he believes it is necessary. He must carry public opinion with him. Roosevelt understood that any overt move toward war, massive rearmament, open alliances, declarations of intent, would provoke backlash and possibly destroy his political authority. Worse, it could split the nation at the very moment unity would be most needed. This created a central paradox that defined Roosevelt's pre-war strategy. He believed the United States needed to prepare for war urgently, but he could not say so openly. He believed America would eventually fight, but he could not ask Americans to fight yet. He needed time to build strength, time to shift opinion, time to prepare the country psychologically as well as materially. In public, Roosevelt reassured voters that he would keep America out of war. In private, he searched for ways to make neutrality flexible, temporary, and ultimately untenable. The key constraint was legitimacy. Roosevelt did not want to drag the nation into war against its will. He wanted the war, when it came, to feel unavoidable, to be perceived as an act of self-defense rather than political choice. Only then would the public support full mobilization, sacrifice, and sustained conflict. This distinction matters. Roosevelt was not trying to manufacture enthusiasm for war. He was trying to prevent paralysis when war arrived. He understood that entering a modern industrial war unprepared could be catastrophic. The United States in 1939 had a small army, outdated equipment, and limited production capacity for weapons. If America waited until after a declaration of war to begin preparing, it would start at a severe disadvantage. So Roosevelt adopted a different approach. He would prepare without declaring, mobilize without announcing, and engage without officially fighting. This was not deception for its own sake. It was a strategy shaped by democratic reality. Roosevelt could not force the country into war, but he could ensure that when war came, the nation would not face it naked and unready. The result was a presidency defined by gradual escalation. Each step was defensible on its own. Each move could be framed as defensive. But together they formed a clear trajectory, away from strict neutrality and toward active involvement. Before Pearl Harbor, America was not at peace in the traditional sense. It was suspended between peace and war, legally neutral, strategically engaged, and quietly preparing for a conflict its president believed was inevitable. This was the starting point of Roosevelt's gamble, to bring America close enough to war that it could survive it without crossing the line until the nation itself was ready to follow. By 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt had begun to act on a hard truth. Neutrality, as Americans understood it, could no longer protect the United States. The fall of France in June of that year shocked the world. In a matter of weeks, one of Europe's great powers collapsed, leaving Britain alone against Nazi Germany. For Roosevelt, this moment confirmed his deepest fears. If Britain fell, the balance of power would tilt decisively, and America would eventually face the consequences. Still, the American public was not ready for war. Roosevelt responded not with dramatic declarations, but with carefully calibrated actions. Each move was framed as defensive, temporary, or pragmatic. Yet taken together, they represented a decisive break from true neutrality. The most striking example came in September 1940, the first peacetime draft in American history. Until then, conscription had been associated only with wartime emergencies. Introducing it during peacetime was controversial and politically risky. Many Americans feared it was a backdoor way to force the country into war. Roosevelt framed the draft as a defensive necessity. The world, he argued, had become too dangerous for an unprepared nation. Training soldiers, he emphasized, did not mean sending them overseas. But the logic beneath the rhetoric was clear. Modern armies cannot be built overnight. If war came, the United States would need trained manpower immediately. The impact was enormous. By late 1941, the U.S. Armed Forces had grown to more than 2.2 million personnel. Training camps expanded across the country. New bases were built. Officers were promoted. Systems for command, logistics, and mobilization were tested and refined before a single declaration of war was issued. At the same time, Roosevelt pushed defense spending to unprecedented levels. Factories received contracts to produce aircraft, ships, and weapons. Research and development accelerated. Industrial leaders were brought into government planning. America's economy began shifting, subtly but steadily, toward a war footing. Perhaps the most consequential step, however, was the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. Under Lend-Lease, the United States provided weapons, vehicles, fuel, and supplies to countries fighting the Axis powers, most notably Britain, and later the Soviet Union and China. Roosevelt described this aid using a simple metaphor: lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. The implication was clear. Helping Britain defend itself was not an act of war. It was common sense. In reality, Lend-Lease was a strategic commitment. By supplying the Allies on a massive scale, the United States tied its industrial capacity to their survival. American factories were now producing not just for national defense, but for active combat overseas. German leaders understood this perfectly. From their perspective, the United States was already an enemy in all but name. Roosevelt knew this risk and accepted it. The genius of Lend-Lease was political as much as strategic. It allowed Roosevelt to bypass the moral paralysis of neutrality without formally abandoning it. The U.S. was not declaring war, but it was shaping the battlefield. It was not sending troops, but it was determining who would still be fighting when those troops eventually arrived. Behind the scenes, Roosevelt also worked to prepare public opinion. His fireside chats emphasized the global threat posed by fascism. He avoided alarmism, but he steadily reframed the conflict as one that endangered American values and security. The language shifted from foreign wars to the defense of democracy. This gradual change mattered. Roosevelt understood that Americans would not support war because of abstract ideology or distant alliances. They would support it only if they believed their own safety was at stake. His challenge was to help them see that connection without provoking fear or resistance. By late 1941, the transformation was well underway. The United States was no longer neutral in any meaningful sense. Its military was expanding, its industry was retooling, its economy was increasingly oriented toward war production. Its allies depended on American support to survive. Yet officially, the nation remained at peace. This liminal state, neither fully neutral nor openly at war, was exactly what Roosevelt had engineered. It bought time, it reduced vulnerability, and it ensured that when the moment of decision arrived, America would not face it unprepared. The country was not yet fighting, but it was no longer pretending that fighting was impossible. Roosevelt had moved the United States to the edge of war, carefully, deliberately, and without crossing the line that public opinion still guarded. The next step would push even closer into the gray zone where peace and war blurred entirely. By the summer of 1941, the United States and Nazi Germany were no longer at peace in any practical sense. Shots had been fired, ships had been sunk, sailors had died, and yet Congress had not declared war. What existed instead was something far more ambiguous and politically delicate, an undeclared naval war in the Atlantic. This gray zone was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate choices by Franklin D. Roosevelt, who understood that the path from neutrality to open war would not be a single leap, but a series of steps, each justified on defensive grounds, each pushing the boundary a little further. The Atlantic Ocean had become the center of this quiet escalation. German U-boats were waging a brutal campaign against British shipping, aiming to starve Britain into submission. After the fall of France, the situation grew dire. If Britain lost control of its supply lines, it would lose the war. Roosevelt believed that outcome would be disastrous for American security, but he still lacked public support for direct military intervention. So once again, he acted indirectly. The U.S. Navy began escorting convoys carrying supplies to Britain, at first within the Western Hemisphere, later farther east. Officially, these actions were defensive, designed to protect American shipping and maintain freedom of the seas. Unofficially, they placed American warships directly in harm's way. The first major flashpoint came in May 1941, when the American merchant ship Robin Moore was sunk by a German U-boat. The ship was unarmed and sailing in what the U.S. considered neutral waters. Though no Americans were killed, the incident shocked Washington. It demonstrated that neutrality no longer guaranteed safety. More confrontations followed. In September 1941, the destroyer USS Greer encountered a German submarine while tracking it for British forces. After a tense standoff, the U-boat fired torpedoes. Though the Greer was not hit, the incident marked a turning point. Roosevelt addressed the nation soon afterward and announced a dramatic new policy. The U.S. Navy would now shoot on sight any German or Italian warship threatening American vessels. This was a profound escalation. A shoot-on-sight order meant that American forces no longer needed to be attacked first. They could fire preemptively. In effect, the United States had authorized combat operations against Germany, without declaring war. Roosevelt justified the move as self-defense, but its implications were unmistakable. America was now actively engaging an Axis power. Further incidents quickly followed. In October, the destroyer USS Kearney was torpedoed while escorting a convoy, killing 11 American sailors. Days later, the USS Reuben James was sunk with the loss of over 100 lives. These were not isolated accidents. They were acts of war in all but name. Public reaction began to shift. While Americans still hesitated at the idea of formally entering the war, tolerance for German aggression was eroding. Roosevelt carefully framed each incident as evidence that the United States was already under threat. The narrative was no longer about helping Britain. It was about defending American lives and interests. Germany, for its part, saw through the legal fiction. Adolf Hitler and his advisors understood that the United States was becoming an active participant in the conflict. Yet Hitler hesitated to declare war first. Germany was already stretched thin, preparing for and executing its invasion of the Soviet Union. Opening another formal front against America seemed strategically unwise. This hesitation benefited Roosevelt. As long as Germany avoided a declaration of war, Roosevelt could continue escalating under the banner of defense. Each convoy escorted, each engagement at sea, further normalized the idea that America was already fighting, just not openly. The result was a dangerous but purposeful ambiguity. American sailors were dying in combat, but the country was not officially at war. The Navy was operating under combat rules, but the nation remained legally neutral. This contradiction could not last forever. Roosevelt understood that. The undeclared war in the Atlantic served two crucial purposes. First, it protected Britain long enough for American industrial production to ramp up. Second, it acclimated the American public to the reality of conflict. By late 1941, the idea that America could remain untouched by the war was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Yet one obstacle remained. Despite growing anger toward Germany, there was still no single event powerful enough to unify the nation behind a full declaration of war. Roosevelt could move the country closer to conflict, but he could not cross the final threshold alone. That final step would come from elsewhere, in a different ocean, from a different enemy. And when it came, the United States would not be starting from zero. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the strategic ambiguity that had defined America's position in the world collapsed in a matter of hours. Japanese aircraft struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor with devastating effect. Battleships burned, planes were destroyed on the ground, and more than 2,400 Americans were killed. The shock was immediate, overwhelming, and unifying. For Franklin D. Roosevelt, Pearl Harbor was not the beginning of America's confrontation with the Axis powers. It was the moment when confrontation could finally be acknowledged openly. The attack accomplished what no speech, policy, or gradual escalation could do on its own. It erased political division. Within hours, isolationism, the dominant force in American politics for 2 decades, lost its legitimacy. The debate over whether the United States should fight was replaced by a single question: how quickly and how decisively? When Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day, his request for a declaration of war was met with near unanimous approval. The nation was united not because it had been persuaded, but because it had been attacked. War was no longer a choice. It was a fact. This distinction mattered deeply. Roosevelt had never needed Pearl Harbor as a political excuse in the cynical sense often implied by conspiracy theories. There is no credible evidence that he knew the attack was coming or allowed it to happen deliberately. What he did understand was structural reality. Only a direct assault on the United States could fully mobilize public opinion in a democratic society. Pearl Harbor provided that catalyst. What followed revealed the significance of Roosevelt's pre-war strategy. The United States did not enter World War II as a blank slate. It entered as a nation already partially mobilized, militarily, industrially, and psychologically. The armed forces, though still inexperienced, were far larger than they had been just 2 years earlier. Training systems were in place. Command structures existed. Bases had been expanded. Millions of men were already in uniform. The peacetime draft, controversial at its inception, now proved invaluable. Industry, too, was already shifting. Defense contracts had retooled factories. Production lines were being redesigned. Supply chains had begun to adapt. The arsenal of democracy was no longer an abstract promise. It was an emerging reality. Pearl Harbor did not create this machinery. It activated it. Even diplomatically, the groundwork had been laid. Through Lend-Lease and naval cooperation, the United States had already aligned itself with Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Operational coordination, logistics, and shared planning had begun before formal alliance agreements were signed. The transition from supporter to combatant was therefore rapid and relatively smooth. This readiness did not make victory easy or immediate. The United States would still suffer defeats, make costly mistakes, and endure years of brutal fighting. But it ensured that America would not face the war in a state of panic or paralysis. In this sense, Pearl Harbor did not transform America. It revealed what America had already become. Roosevelt's true achievement lies not in manipulating events, but in managing time. He bought time for training, for production, for adaptation. He pushed the nation toward war without tearing it apart politically. He ensured that when unity finally came, it would rest on preparation rather than improvisation. Critics have long debated whether Roosevelt went too far before Pearl Harbor or not far enough. That debate will continue. But the outcome is difficult to dispute. The United States entered World War II faster, stronger, and more organized than it otherwise would have. The war that followed would be fought on distant shores, but its foundations were laid in the years of uneasy peace before December 1941. America did not stumble into World War II blindly. It arrived already moving. Pearl Harbor was the spark, but the fire had already been built. That is why the United States, shocked but not shattered, could transition from neutrality to total war with remarkable speed, and why Roosevelt's quiet, controversial preparation proved decisive in the long struggle that followed.